All right. Thank you, Victoria. If you would like to see the captions, you should be able to, I believe it's under more, the ... on your screen. Or no, sorry, that's from my perspective. But for me, it's more, and then there's a captions option, and you should be able to view or hide the captions and also change the size of them, by the way. And we'll just give it another minute for folks to arrive since we know it's quite early in the morning, at least for me. All right, shall we begin? Excellent. All right. Thank you for being here, everyone. This is toward a trauma-informed teaching practice as part of our August faculty workshops. My name is the second one on there. I'm Shed, like the thing in your backyard. I go by she or they pronouns, and I'm a teaching and learning specialist at the CTRL, and I'll pass it over to my co-presenter.
Hello, I'm Katharine Manning. I usually go by Kate and use she, her pronouns. I am a lawyer who focuses on helping to build more empathetic and trauma-informed workplaces. I'm also an adjunct professor in the Justice, Law, and Criminology department and have been, I guess, since 2018. Very excited for this program. This is one that Shed and I have taught together in the past. I'm hoping it will be very interactive. So I've got the chat up over here. If you see me looking over here, I'm looking at the chat. So I hope that you will participate fully in terms of questions, sharing your own ideas and experiences. I want this to be as interactive as possible because I think it just makes for a better experience for all of us and helps make sure that you are getting the information that you need. And the reason that you showed up this morning.
Thank you, Kate. So just to go over a quick session agenda, we're going to start with some ground rules, which we like to do in our CTRL events, is start with some sort of shared norms. Then we're going to talk about sources of trauma, strategies for the classroom, and then Kate is going to bring us to a reflective place about where we are, strategies for ourselves, and dealing with compassion fatigue. I also want to thank Jacqueline Darby, former Director of Wellbeing Outreach and Prevention Services, for providing a lot of material that we used here as we've presented this material with her in the past. So just want to express my appreciation to her for that. To start with our ground rules, just want to let you know we're going to be talking about trauma and trauma experiences. We're not going to talk about anything in explicit detail, but I just wanted you to be aware. If you need to take care of yourself, please feel free to do so. If you are giving classroom examples, please respect confidentiality and privacy. So if for any, to do whatever you need to do to feel comfortable and help you feel engaged, you know yourself best, so you know what you need. And if you are speaking about something that happened in class, we just ask you to do your best to protect the identities of those who are in that story. Pass that to you, Kate.
Hello, me again. Yeah, just to flesh out a little bit our roadmap for today. After this, I'm going to go through a quick definition of trauma, just so that we can all get on a kind of level playing field in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to Shed, who will discuss sources of trauma, including things that may be showing up in the classroom and on campus, as well as effects and signs of trauma, so that the goal of this presentation is to help you both recognize trauma and be able to better respond to it. So part of that is understanding the effects and signs of trauma, which are not always intuitive, things that may come across as anger or disengagement may in fact be a trauma response. So we'll talk a little bit about how to get better at spotting that. And then we're going to talk, and again, this will be Shed leading this part of the discussion. We'll be talking some about a trauma-informed approach to teaching. And then for the final part of this discussion, I'm going to lead a conversation about compassion fatigue, which is really what can happen when we are doing such a phenomenal job of supporting the people around us and maybe not doing as much, not focusing as intently as we need to on taking care of ourselves. So we'll talk a little bit about how to both recognize compassion fatigue and how to prevent it. So what is trauma? You know, this is a term that I think has probably a million different definitions and understandings of what it is. Sometimes I talk to people who clearly think trauma is something that only sexual assault survivors and combat veterans have experienced. I use a different definition of trauma. The definition of trauma that I use is a psychological injury that impairs performance. This is the definition that I use in my work with organizations. It is kind of a slimmed down version of the definition of trauma that is used by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. What I like about that definition is that, in contrast to a lot of other definitions, it doesn't give you a list of life experiences and then say, if you have experienced one of these, then you have experienced trauma. What I don't like about that type of definition is that we all have different reactions to similar or even the exact same circumstance. Like if you have three people who are in a car accident together, one of them may be shaken up at the scene, but able to talk to police and other drivers, check on people, and kind of make their way into work afterward and seem to be kind of okay. A second one may completely fall apart, go to the hospital, end up staying out of work for a week, not be able to get in a car for a month. A third one maybe seems fine, goes into work, but then later that night falls apart. None of those is the right reaction to a traumatic event. They're all just in the range of normal human responses to a really difficult circumstance. So I don't want us to spend too much time worrying about whether this thing that the person has gone through counts as trauma. To me, the concern is more, is there a person in front of me who needs some help? And if so, let's get them some help. And that's really the second part of the definition. It's that impairs performance. In particular, because we're talking about a workplace, you know, you're talking about your students, maybe your colleagues, your supervisor. We aren't there to be each other's therapists. I don't want you to be, you know, calling students into your office hours and talking to them about their childhood traumas or anything like that. It's really, is there something going on that's keeping you from being able to perform in the ways that you want and need to? And if so, let's get you some help. And on that last piece of, we're not there to be therapists, I really think of this as, it's like mental health first aid. The goal is to, you know, be the person on the scene who sees that there's something going on, provide some immediate support, and then refer them on to the experts if that's the appropriate next step. And I guess one more thing on this before I turn it back over to Shed, this idea of trauma-informed. I know that trauma-informed can be almost a buzzword, it seems like lately, and it's another term that I think there's not a lot of understanding of what that means. When I use the term trauma-informed, I just mean that you have an understanding that trauma exists in the world and has a negative effect on people, and you're working to prevent and mitigate those effects. So if you are a trauma-informed educator, for instance, you're somebody who is aware that on campus and in your classroom, there are people who are experiencing trauma, and you're doing your best not to exacerbate or cause trauma among your students and your colleagues. Is there anything you want to add on that, Shed?
I really like that definition and how you described it. I would say too, the oh, I lost what I was going to say. Well, never mind. It's okay. I'll let you wrap up.
Yeah, well, so then I guess I just wanted to open it up to the audience as well. And you can either type in the chat or unmute yourself or raise your hand if you'd like. But just if you have anything that you'd like to add to that or any questions about it, let me just give a little pause here in case we want to, if anybody wants to respond on that. All right, I'm not seeing anybody unmuting. I can't tell if anybody's typing in the chat, but I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. Why don't we hand it back over to Shed? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes. Oh, I was going to add the when it comes to being trauma informed, exactly to your point, Kate, I would say that it's understanding it, like that trauma is not exceptional, that it's not, once a year you get a student with trauma. It's, we all are dealing with it in different ways. So being really cognizant and building an environment that accounts for that, instead of treating it as, an aberration, an unusual thing that happens. So I want to talk about some sources of trauma that we might encounter, that our students might encounter. So I'm going to go over these, and then we're going to talk about what it looks like. So these are 4 categories of trauma. Again, these are not official by some sort of universal standard. This is just one way to categorize them. Direct trauma is probably the one that we are most familiar with when we think of trauma. Things like violence, neglect, abuse, gaslighting, accidents, loss, separation, illness, disasters, war, displacement, discrimination, and poverty. So experiencing a direct type of psychological injury, like Kate said. But then we also have vicarious trauma, which is really, I think, under discussed, which is taking on trauma after observing or engaging it in others. So can we think of some professions? I said, especially helpers and workers, some professions that might be especially sensitive to vicarious trauma or have a tendency towards it. Feel free to share in the chat or over video. What are some professions that come to mind that might be susceptible to vicarious trauma?
Police officers.
Yeah, people working in enforcement.
Those that have to screen on the internet like that, those that screen YouTube videos and stuff like that.
Right. Oh, that's real. Oh, wow. I never thought about that. That's a really good point, Arthur. Yeah, having to be the person who mitigates violent imagery for others must really be challenging. Emergency room stuff, totally, Lucy. Crisis intervention, people who are doing it like triage. Yeah. Oh, I love this. Vicarious trauma can happen for journalists, yes, or nonprofit workers working in conflict areas. I could say, if you are exposed to certain types of violences, right? It's not necessarily that you go through it, but supporting or witnessing others going through it can have an impact on you, and that is legitimate. That is a form of trauma that you might deal with, even if you didn't personally experience it. Then we have historical trauma, which we can say is cumulative emotional and psychological injury over the lifespan and generations from massive group trauma. I'll ask you all for your input again. What are some massive group traumas that come to mind that are kind of like echoing still with us today? Or maybe that even happened recently? Some historical traumas.
Native American displacement.
Yes, totally. Native American displacement, reservations, Trail of Tears, colonialism, racism. Absolutely, Stephanie. Yeah. The Holocaust. Yes, that lives still today with people in a major way. COVID-19. Thank you, Matt. Yes. The insurrection at the Capitol. Yes, Darlene, those are excellent answers. And often under appreciated, well, not appreciated, but not acknowledged enough as something that can really traumatize us. Maybe we weren't there, but we still are impacted by it. And I wanted to make a note here about epigenetics, because there is some research on epigenetics that suggests trauma can actually be passed down genetically in different ways, imprinted on genetics, which is really interesting. And then we have intergenerational, taking on trauma which was experienced by those with whom one has lived or passed the long generations. So maybe something in your family, maybe a family member dealt with abuse, and some of the survival strategies that they have adapted have been passed on to you or another family member, or perhaps something around substance misuse has been passed down, trauma around that in your family. So these are all real forms of trauma that we deal with and that our students deal with. So actually, well, let me back up. Let me ask you, what are some effects and signs of trauma that we might recognize? What are some things that immediately come to mind for us? Withdrawal, irascibility, well said. Manaswini, let me know if I said that okay. Irascibility, yeah.
It's a hard name to pronounce. That's all right.
Can you say it for me?
Oh, it's Manaswini, but I go by Manu.
Mana. Thank you. Thank you. It's a nice name. Other things that we think of when we think of expressions of trauma. It's not a trick question.
Maybe addiction or alcoholism.
Right? Disengagement, totally solely relying on substances, anxiety, insomnia, difficulty sleeping. These are all correct. I want to share this list here of some of the effects and signs of trauma that we may be familiar with or not. Give you a second to look at these. And what I highlighted here, so first I wanted to highlight survivor's guilt in the right-hand column. Are folks familiar? Give me a thumbs up, maybe if you've heard of the term survivor's guilt or are familiar with what it means. Yeah, Kate's like me, but that doesn't count because it's my full-time thing. Okay, excellent. Does anyone want to try describing how they understand survivor's guilt? It doesn't have to be like a clinical definition or anything like that. How do you understand it?
The remorse that comes from not suffering something that your partner or close friend or somebody that you're affectionate towards suffers when you were also in the same situation, perhaps.
That's a beautiful definition. I really like that. Remorse for not suffering, right? Like surviving or getting through something that those around you who you cared for didn't make it through. So when we think about this, we might typically think, again, like more sort of mainstream examples of trauma, like surviving through something that other people die in or deal with injury during. But I do want to highlight also that survivor's guilt doesn't necessarily have to do with physical violence. It can deal with systemic violence. So for example, some first generation students feel a sense of survivor's guilt when they're the only one in their community or family to make it to college. It might be, right, like a sense of remorse. Why did I make it? How come everyone else didn't make it? So there are forms of trauma and guilt that we deal with that, right, they don't actually have to do, they have a different type of violence than physical violence, or can include physical violence. I also highlighted fatigue, hypervigilance, and memory issues. So hypervigilance would be being constantly on edge, right? Being constantly anxious and not wanting to engage fully because it feels too vulnerable. I highlighted these three because a lot of people have been talking about feeling this since, I don't know, March 2020-ish. So the effect the pandemic has had on people has affected people's memories. It's affected their patience when it comes to checking the news or learning about what's going on in the world. And people feel tired a lot. Maybe you feel that way. Maybe you can use a reaction to show, like, does this resonate with you? Have you felt this? Or do you know people who have felt this? Yeah. Yes. Right. So this is something that I feel like we could really address better as a society. Is COVID-19 is a trauma that we're all dealing with, and we can see it playing out not just in physical trauma that people have, but also that we feel tired. We feel like we can't, like, I don't want to check the news. I don't want to know what's going on because it's going to be bad. We feel like our short-term memory is kind of messed up, and our students feel the same. They're dealing with the same thing. Yeah. So this is where I want to ask us to pivot a little bit and think about not just the classic criteria of trauma, the effects that I showed on the last slide, but what it might look like among our students. So if students are expressing trauma, maybe we don't know that they are not sleeping or that they are, dealing with something at home, but maybe they express something in class or in conversation that gives you a sign. So what could trauma look like when it's expressed by our students and we're their instructors? What have you noticed?
Maybe ghosting. I had a student who just vanished. I was like, oh, I guess bye. She wasn't responding to emails. Like, just gone.
Has anyone else had a student ghost them? Monica says yes. Just a student just disappear and yeah. Depending on the content of the class, yeah. Disinterestedness or extreme engagement. Oh, so maybe it maybe feels like there's a lot emotionally riding on their engagement in the class. It feels really like intense and tenuous. That's a great example. Quality of work changes. That's an excellent point, right? You're familiar with how a student tends to engage and then suddenly it changes abruptly, right? The point I want to sort of reinforce here is that trauma doesn't always look, like Kate said, like a list of clinical criteria, and that often students' expressions of trauma come off as laziness, I don't care, I don't care what the instructor thinks, right? But sometimes we want to look like always want to look a little closer, because it may be an expression of trauma that's coming from the student. When they suddenly withdraw or ghost, or they seem super disengaged, or the quality of the work changes, it could be that something is going on, and that's the way that it's being expressed by them. And there's sort of a trauma there. And so to reinforce why this is important to address, I want to quickly point out that trauma and learning are not friends. In fact, they're enemies. Trauma is always going to get in the way of learning, and trauma is not a teaching tool either. When people encounter trauma, they tend to shut down and they close off the opportunity for learning, right? Because they're just trying to get through the moment. So we might call this a fight or flight response when people are in crisis mode. You may have heard fight, flight, freeze. Freeze we see all the time in animals, right? Like a deer. I know you see the deer that are in this area. They're out of control. They freeze, right? That's a response humans have too to danger sometimes. Or fawn, F-A-W-N, which would be trying to appeal to the threat to calm it down, which often happens for folks in abusive relationships who are trying to talk down or calm down the abuser so that they will not lash out with violence. So fight, flight, freeze, fawn, these are all legitimate responses people have to trauma. But when you're traumatized and you're in this state of like survival, how are you going to learn if you constantly feel concerned for your safety? You're not focused on the concept in class. You're focused on living through the moment. You may know that you're not going to be hurt in the class physically, but that doesn't stop you from feeling on edge and hypervigilant. And so we know that learning is not going to happen when students are in this state, and it's going to lead to distraction, inability to focus, and a lack of energy. And then, of course, it's harmful when sustained over a long period of time. For people to be in fight or flight for more than like a minute or two at a time is really going to suck their energy. It's really going to, disengage them from everything, which is why, right, we want to address it.
Can I add something on that,
Yes,
Jen?
please. Yes.
One of the things that I think about for myself and about when I'm working with people is that you don't get to pick when that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and you don't get to pick which of those you're going into. It's like you have a part of your brain that just kind of takes over. People call it amygdala hijack. And so you may think that like, oh, well, if I just explain to them that I'm not trying to threaten them, like they'll calm down, but that's not really how it works. So the best thing we can do, and I'm sure you're going to get into this, Shed, is just trying to create an environment that appears safe, that actually brings the temperature down, is more helpful than just trying to explain to somebody why they're not in danger.
Stop having trauma. It did it. Yeah, it is really challenging, right? And thank you for pointing that out. I like that amygdala hijack. Now let's see if I remember. Amygdala responsible for fear and anger.
Yeah, it's like the part back here, like in the brain stem, people call it the lizard brain, and its job is to keep us safe. So that's the thing that controls our nervous system. It's the one that's always looking in our environment, trying to figure out if there's danger. And if it finds danger, then it puts us into a stress response, which is what people commonly know as the fight, flight, or freeze, where we get a flood of adrenaline and a suppression of complex thinking. And sadly, the amygdala does not understand English. You just have to try to calm it down through showing it that you're safe.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. And so being in that state for constantly, right? Or even for a class session, that's exhausting. And we can see the effect that it has on all of us. So this is, trauma-informed teaching is just such a huge topic. Like Kate had said, like we've presented on this before, and there's so much to share. I do have a full presentation about trauma-informed teaching that if you'd like access to, I'm really happy to share the slideshow and materials that really gets into every step of this approach. But just to give us a basic overview and a few strategies today, these are the components of a trauma-informed approach, which is informed by trauma-informed medical approaches. So the roots of that are really in medical care, and these scaffold onto each other. And so we begin by establishing safety and learning spaces. Safety is a pretty controversial sort of concept, and you may feel uncomfortable with the idea of a safe space or have some different sort of critiques of it identity wise. I would say not to focus so much on safety, but on creating trust in your environment so that students feel a sense of belonging. Understanding and acknowledging trauma, offering options and flexibility, encouraging collaboration and connection, and helping students imagine the future. Some folks give this like 7 or 8 components, but this is sort of a really basic overview. And let's talk about some strategies. So what can we do to help? So here are some tips and tools for teaching, and Kate is going to talk to us about what we do for our own, what we're dealing with. So giving warnings is really important. Having a simple content warning in your syllabus and before presenting highly anxiety-producing material prepares students to respond. So this semester, I know that I am going to teach about sexual violence for 1 or 2 class sessions. And so I want to give my students ample warning because I don't want to put my students who have dealt with that violence in a position of reacting in the moment with fear, right? I want to give students notice of what we're going to talk about. And my recommendation to you would be to give this warning more than once because, you don't know who's there in class to hear you, or you don't know who reads the Canvas messages, right? So give that warning a couple times and give detail. I've noticed that a lot of folks will give content warnings and then say, for difficult topics. Ooh, okay. What could that mean? Is it about this thing? Because I know that I need to separate, there's some topics where I know I need to remove myself. I need that trigger warning is helpful for me to know that it's not going to be comfortable for me. Other things I'm totally fine learning about, right? So we want to be a little specific with our students. This is a great question, Katharine. What are some topics for which a content warning might be a good idea? Because it's not everything, right? What do we think? Graphic violence, excellent point. Yeah. If you feel that that's important to show your students, you want to give them ample warning, or maybe even tell them, sometimes when I watch movies that have violence in them, I warn my students, ahead of time when there's going to be blood on screen. Some people can't even look at blood, right? I don't want a student passing out in my room.
Yeah, I try to do it. I don't show videos mostly because I can't figure out the technology of it. But I try to give a content warning anytime there's going to be a pretty graphic description of violence or abuse.
Yeah. Sexual abuse, racism and discrimination, graphic images, self-harm. So something that you think might resonate with a person's experience that could be traumatic, you might want to give a warning for it, right? And to give them a little bit of detail and to offer students a way to communicate to you that maybe they need, maybe they cannot be there for that class session because they are going through something right now and being there would not be helpful for them. Can we give them an alternate assignment? Can we ask them to come to your office? Can we find a middle ground with them so that they can show, they're not missing class because they don't care. They're missing class because they can't attend without going into a trauma response. So we want to respect that for students.
Yeah, Shed, let me just underscore that.
Please.
I totally agree. I feel like, the issue of content warning and giving alternative assignments is not like, oh, they're getting a free pass, like, oh, you get to just walk away from class or you get to do an easier assignment or something like that. It's understanding that the content itself is going to be a barrier to learning. So let's figure out a way around that. So if you know that this movie that you're offering or this book that you're offering is going to be super, super helpful for some people, and for others, it is going to be, it's going to put them into a tailspin, and it's going to make it difficult for them to engage with that topic and maybe others as well, then let's figure out a way around that, because ultimately our goal is education of the students. And if this is a barrier to it, let's figure out an alternative.
Mana, please go ahead.
Sorry, I just have a question at this
Yeah.
at this stage. I know we went over the signs and indicators of picking out trauma. But the thing is, so sometimes we teach classes with, say, 15 to 20 students, and how can we parse routine like disengagement from the content? Maybe it's boring or they're not interested in the topic from it being an indicator of trauma. Like, how would we know that that's the student we need to pay special attention to, or make a different assignment for them and give content warnings and things like that?
That's an excellent question. Kate, what pass it to you, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, so I've had, I've taught a class called Victims' Rights, where we have about a dozen. It's an upper level JLC class. So we have usually like 12 to 15 students in the class. And some of the topics are things like sexual assault, domestic violence. In my experience, I mean, I think maybe part of it is because we start from the very beginning with, there's a content warning on the syllabus, but also a discussion at the very beginning about what can come up, self-soothing tools for it, alternatives. So it's a pretty open conversation from the beginning about the fact that some things here might be difficult for some people. And I get to know the students pretty well. Now, I'm not teaching giant classes, and, maybe that makes it easier on me, but for me, it's a little bit easier to tell, because we've already had this context of an open discussion about these topics. I can see, okay, this student, I don't know if she's just tired today, or like if this was a hard topic. I might kind of just swing by at the end of class, like, hey, just checking in, how are you doing? And then it's just like opening the door to the conversation. You can't force anybody to disclose anything they don't want to, of course. You're just kind of opening the door and allowing them to say, this was a hard topic for me. And sometimes they'll say that, and sometimes they'll say, I was at rugby practice until until 9 p.m. and I'm exhausted today, and that's fine too. But just kind of, to me, it's an ongoing conversation, and reiterating throughout that it is okay to share things with me if you are feeling, if you're having a hard time because you're sick, or because a parent is sick, or because this is a topic that's hard for you. We're kind of creating the environment from the beginning where it's safe to have those kinds of conversations, and that makes it easier for me to approach them later, or send a quick, message afterward, like, hey, I noticed that you missed class, or you seemed a little off today. I just wanted to let you know that I'm here, and, check in and see how you're doing. I don't know that you can tell just by looking at somebody who's disengaged whether it is because of trauma or not, unless it's pretty stark. I mean, usually, like, I'm not surprising people with the information. There was one time where we had a survivor come to class and share her story, a sexual assault survivor. And I didn't know, she was there to kind of talk generally about victim issues. I didn't know if she was going to share her story or not, and she ended up sharing her story. One of my students, who was just like a phenomenal student, really like one of my favorites, so engaged and kind to others and wonderful. She was so bothered by the story. Again, there's 12 of us sitting around a conference table. She turned her chair and faced the back of the room, like faced the wall that was like a foot away from her. She just turned her back on the survivor. Now, I know that was a trauma response, because that was so out of character for her. And it was so clearly tied to when the survivor began sharing her story. But absent something that blatant, it's not easy to tell just from disengagement. So that's, for me, just a sign for a check-in. And again, creating the atmosphere where people know that it's okay to talk about hard things with you. Does that help, Manu? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah. And anybody else have, kind of examples or thoughts on that question of recognizing trauma among students?
Katharine, your story remind me of last semester. I instruct AUX2, and you know, I had a student just like you described. She's a great student leader in the classroom in terms of speaking and talking. But we hit someone had mentioned a story, kind of was tangent to what we were talking about, but it related. And then she just kind of got up and left. You know, and I was in the flow of what we are talking about, so I didn't take extreme note of it like I usually do. What my peer facilitator noticed, but when she came back like at the end of class, and then she described, you know, what was going on and why and whatnot. And I think it was because, you know, the peer facilitator and I did a good job at the beginning of class telling students, you know, this is what these are things that we'll talk about. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, you feel away, you know, you could take care of yourself however you see fit. And, you know, we'll check up with you. So she was willing to, you know, come back and talk to us about it without us having to go, you know, chase her down to find out what's going on and stuff like that.
Right. Oh, you're muted, Kate.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, I think that's perfect, and good job to you and your co-facilitator for creating that environment in the first place where she knew it was okay to take care of herself, because when people feel trapped, that can exacerbate that stress or trauma response, right? So I think, you know, that's just a sign that you all had created an environment where she didn't feel like it's going to be a huge deal if I walk away and everybody's going to stare at me and judge me. And then the fact that she felt comfortable opening up, that's fantastic. So good job. And thank you for sharing that.
I think we had a hand up in case that person does want to speak. Please feel free.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I think I'm just thinking over the and I'm just trying to think about, there's so many triggers, and I'm wondering how specific should we be content warnings, because sometimes even if you say something, you never know what can trigger someone else, right? And so my question is, should we encourage them to stay in the class, but offer, not necessarily stay in the class, but I mean, they can leave and come back, but attend that session, knowing that at any moment they can leave. We'll offer some, you know, self-soothing exercises, or maybe breathing exercise. I like to do a lot of breathing exercises with my students, or yeah, or should we, my question, I guess, is about how much should we encourage them to, or help them with the tools to cope, and how, or just let them, or just give them that out of, okay, you don't have to attend at all. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. It's an excellent question that we kind of like struggle with in different ways. And I would say, I think it's really great to share like coping strategies with your students, because it humanizes it and it shows that like there's nothing to be ashamed of, and that it's a very real thing, which is part of trauma-informed teaching, is like recognizing that what students are going through is real and that you appreciate it. I think it can be helpful to give students the out, but also maybe say, like, if you do come to class, I am going to like, I understand if you need to take a moment, I'm going to offer you these coping strategies, but also to allow a student to have the choice that if it's an especially challenging conversation. Speaking for myself, I know when we talk about trigger warnings, it's like, you know, like, I'll just share my own experience. So for me, a trauma response that I have is hiding under tables. And so I would be very nervous to go to class and then try to find a table to hide under, right? If I was triggered. So I like the idea. I love the idea of modeling some strategies and teaching them strategies, or even asking them to share strategies with each other. And then, but if students do really feel like they can't be there, to give them a line of communication, I think, to express that. That's a great question.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Shed, I'll just kind of give my spin on it. So the way that I handle that is in the first class, we have a discussion about those kind of self-soothing, like you said, the breathing techniques. I share a couple of others, like name it to tame it, just engage your like check in with how you are feeling. Like you notice your heart rate going up, you notice, then ask yourself, how am I feeling? I'm feeling scared, I'm feeling angry, feeling threatened. Just putting a name to it can help you feel more in control. Another one I share is engaging one of your senses. So noticing the smell of coffee from the next room, or putting your hand on the desk and feeling it, is it smooth or rough? Those are things that can ground you in the present moment. And that's your way of, remember I talked about like the amygdala and it doesn't understand English. If you can show it that I'm safe, I'm right here, I'm, sitting at my desk, I'm not being chased by a bear, that can help calm down your nervous system. And then I also open it up for discussion, and the students will have some of their own to share. And I like that, one, because they have great ideas, but also because it's kind of modeling that this is a good thing. Like you are, it's a helpful thing in the classroom if you are somebody who can share things about how to take care of yourself. And I always leave open the idea of walking away. It doesn't happen all that often, I have found. Another thing in terms of the, we'll talk about it more generally in the first class, the content warning. But if we have a class where we are going to be getting into detail about something difficult, like we're going to be reading a case about sexual assault that has some detail about it, and it's going to be important to the discussion, I will say, so in this class, we're going to be talking about X case. There is pretty graphic detail of a sexual assault there. It's about these pages. It's not super relevant to the things that we're going to be discussing, so you're welcome to skip that part in the reading, but I do want to just let you know it may come up in the class discussion. Just giving people that level of detail about it allows them to prepare themselves. And, Shed talked about creating a safe environment. To me, a big part of safety is transparency. Like, do I understand what is coming? And I will tell you from my personal experience, I have a family history of domestic violence. And, often I am encountering images involving intimate partner violence. It's harder when there's no warning. When I sort of stumble upon it, it hits me a little harder than if I know this is coming and I can kind of like gear myself up. It's not like I have to leave the classroom or anything. It just helps me to know that that's coming. And I can, remind myself of the breathing, the, touching the desk, all of those same soothing techniques.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And two things I wanted to add. The first is when it comes to transparency, this is such a great point. Okay, maybe I mentioned this on the next slide and I'm giving myself away, but explaining to students why you're engaging that material. So I am going to, I'm going to show this graphic video where we're going to talk about sexual violence, but why? It's for a purpose. It helps students understand, right? You're not doing it for fun. You're doing it for a purpose to help them build a skill in the class. The other thing I would say is a really good question we had earlier about how can you tell disengagement from, a trauma response that, sort of like a more typical disengagement. Something that might help is asking students to like set goals for themselves, or do some sort of check-in at the beginning of the semester. Like, what are they excited about? What goal are they going to set for themselves for like learning this semester? Not anything you grade, but something that lets you know how they are at the start. And then maybe if you notice that suddenly they're drifting away from their goal, because some students will be like, I just want to get through the class. You're like, I got it, but some students say like, I'm really passionate about this. So when you notice the withdrawal, it is a little more telling. So let me make sure I have an eye on the chat. Yeah. So Moya asks about sharing the situation. A non-Black instructor pulled a Black student aside after a class where the discussion centered white supremacy. The instructor inquired about her perceived disengagement. She felt offended. She was just tired. This is challenging because it sounds like perhaps the instructor expected the student to speak up in a certain way because of her identity, which is really challenging. Or maybe that wasn't what they meant, but that's how it felt to the student. And that's really challenging. What might be a different way to approach a student who an instructor perceives as disengaged? I think I would attend to it if it's a pattern. If I see it as a pattern, for one session, everyone's got bad days, right? Everyone has challenging days. Everyone has days when they're tired. Kate, what do you think?
I feel like the open-ended question is going to be your friend here. As we talked about earlier with the definition of trauma, it varies from person to person. So it's better not to assume that based on the fact that I know that we had this classroom discussion, I expect you to be traumatized is not going to be useful, because as it happened with this student, it was in fact offensive to assume that she would have been traumatized by that discussion. She, I'm sure, has talked a lot more about white supremacy and has a better understanding of it than maybe her instructor. So maybe not assuming that, but just an open-ended question. Hey, just checking in. You doing all right? How are things going with you? Without the like, because I know this discussion may have been really hard for you, because that can feel like almost an invasion. Yeah, and I'm seeing Naoko.
Hi. Yeah, so I teach contemporary photography course, and every single class is like, violence, drugs, contemporary photography try to show something socially hidden, invisible. And it's easier for me to share something like abuse or war, but sometimes like drug use or nudity, I don't even know that need to be content warning because it's every day, every class. So I guess is nudity trigger trauma? I mean,
Oh, sorry. This is a great question. Kate, were you going to say something?
Oh, I would probably handle that if it's something that is going to come up in the classroom, to just be very clear about that from the beginning. Of course, for some people, nudity can trigger trauma. You don't know what kind of background they've had of sexual abuse or other kinds of exposure to nudity that can be traumatizing. So just laying out the information, again, kind of transparency from the beginning, is, I think, probably how I would handle that.
I agree.
Yeah, make sure we get to Moya as well.
I would say, I mean, it's funny because I don't think of nudity as something that the students need to be, well, it's tough, right? Because it's art. What I would say is, I love that idea of being really clear with them what you're going to do and why you're doing it, right? So like, there's a reason we're looking at this, and the reason that, right, the artistic importance. So I want you to take this seriously, right? Go ahead, Moya.
Hi, Katharine. Hi, Shed. Thank you for this excellent presentation. I am a postdoc fellow in the School of Ed, and the situation that I referenced is a tricky situation, right? Which is why I wanted to share it with the group and invite perspectives on it. And the student came to me, a different instructor, and shared this experience with me. And I'm going to be honest, right? Like, I could completely understand why the student was offended. And I could completely understand why the instructor may have wanted to check in with that student. And so what I'd like to offer to the excellent comments that you both made is that as instructors, we need to check our own assumptions, and we need to continue to process, especially around topics that we imagine might be difficult for students. We need to be intentional about processing how we're feeling about the topic, going into the topic, checking in with ourselves even as we're delivering the content, right? And then the post-class actions that we may take. Is it coming from a place of our assumptions, or is it coming from a place of a pattern of behavior, for example, that shows disengagement? So I just wanted to offer that and add that to the excellent comments that were already made. Thank you.
That's so beautifully said. I was just gonna let it be because it's so good. Thank you for sharing that. And I think Kate's gonna touch on that reflection a little.
Yeah, I think that's so important. To me, the idea of being trauma informed has within it that we are doing our best not to create trauma. And when we are not willing to interrogate our assumptions and the things that we are teaching and why, we might fall into that, right? Inadvertently. I mean, I'm sure that this professor was not intending to harm her student or his or her student, right? So I think it's part of it is trying to check our own assumptions, as you said, and continuously doing that. And then in terms of just the logistics of it, I tend to find it better to share information from the front of the classroom. This is what we're going to talk about, being specific about what it is and why you're talking about it. And then when it comes to the responses from others, just open-ended questions, how are you doing? Without that assumption baked in. I mean, I'll share my own story, and I know we should be getting on, but when my father died, I mean, I shared with you already that I had a family history of domestic violence. When my father passed away, I was working at a big law firm, and he died on a Saturday, and I came into work on Monday. And all day long at work, people were saying, "Oh my gosh, I heard about your father. I'm so sorry. I can't even believe you're here. You should just go home. None of this matters. Just go home." And I know they were trying to be comforting to me, but they didn't know the whole history with him. And they were bringing their own assumptions about, what it means to lose a father that were not relevant to me. And instead of being comforting, it was more painful because it just highlighted, maybe I didn't have the right reaction to losing my father, or we didn't have the kind of relationship we were supposed to. So their efforts to try to be caring were more painful for me. Whereas if alternatively, they just were like, "Hey, I heard about your dad. I'm really sorry. Anything I can do?" That's so much better. Right? Than having that like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, and let's all process together." Like, I didn't want any of that. So I think that's kind of important, is just don't make assumptions of, because this happened, I expect this response, because that expectation itself can actually be harmful and painful. Thank you, Moya.
Thank you for that. So I want to finish up this slide for us so we can move on to Kate's segment, allowing for self-soothing. So, right, we all have different ways of soothing ourselves. And I don't want us to, punish students for doing that. So, letting students maybe stand up, take a break, move around, like the whole class taking a break or a big breath together can be a nice way to break that tension of a difficult conversation. Using something like a fidget spinner or like a fidget toy is actually really important for people who like neurodiversity. People process in all different kinds of ways, and having tools like fidget spinners around or things that help you stim can actually help calm you and help you focus on the content of the course. Leaving the room or doodling. I'm a doodler. That doesn't mean I'm not paying attention. These simple actions help with grounding. Perhaps you are a person who has a place you like to sit when you enter a room. A lot of us have a preference. I know a lot of people like to sit without their back to the door. So things like this are really important for feeling comfortable and like you can take in new information. If you're busy feeling like really stilted and stuck in place, that you feel kind of on edge, it's hard to learn, right? And of course, having resources readily available, like in your syllabus, bringing them up maybe at the end of the class where you teach on the challenging topic. Oh, that's a great question, Lucy. And maybe we can get to that towards the end in our Q&A. For those of us who teach remotely on Zoom, how can we recognize trauma? Excellent question. Just to move through these. Right. Being mindful of the material structure, right? We want to try and break things up a little bit for our students, also for ourselves. Teaching about violence repeatedly is pretty exhausting. Ask yourself if this is necessary. This comes back to Kate's point about transparency. Why are students dealing with the graphic or challenging material? Showing them what the reason is and asking yourself, okay, do I need to show them the violent material, or can I transmit it to them in a different way? Or if we do watch it, can I explain to them really clearly what they're watching for and what they're supposed to be taking from it? Right. So, you don't necessarily have to go through the thing, but watching a traumatic incident can really lead to a vicarious trauma response. So we want to prepare our students for what they're going to watch. or read. And of course, showing grace. There's a line between being informed and being triggered. For some, that line is thick. For others, it's thin. Prepare your space for those who have thin lines. So we don't want to assume that everyone is in great shape and can just, brush all of it off. Start from the perspective of those who are the most vulnerable and think about how we can serve them, how we can work for them. If we take care of them, then we're going to be helping everyone in the class. So rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing. So before we transition to Kate, I want to ask you quickly to share in the chat, what's one of your favorite forms of self-care? And this could be something really helpful to share with your students too. But go ahead and share, no right answers.
Yeah, I love that idea of sharing it with your students. Yeah, Moya, my breathing is one of mine too. I call it noisy self-care. Like, it's not just that we are taking care of ourselves, we're doing it out loud, because that demonstrates that it really is okay. You can say, wow, this has been a really heavy topic. I think I need a quick break. I'm going to go outside, look at the sky for 5 minutes. I encourage you to do the same. And then let's meet back here at 9:45 or whatever it is.
Love that.
Yeah, and that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. I assume you mean the 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah.
Oh, anchoring. Nice. Sorry, did you want to add?
TF, were you about to clarify the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1?
Exactly that. The 5 things you can see, using the 5 senses just to get back to our bodies, and it helps with anxiety a lot. So I think 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste, but I'm missing 1. Hear.
2 things you can hear, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I do a different thing for each one. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, it's that kind of grounding technique. And you could even do looking around the room. Can I list 3 blue things that I see? It's just all about kind of calming your nervous system. I love that one.
I love that. There's also some really interesting there's calming properties for certain scents, which is kind of like the basis of aromatherapy, but smelling something really pungent like peppermint will really, really get your focus back on the moment. We have beautiful ideas in the chat. Cup of coffee while listening to my favorite music. I love that. Mindful eating or cooking, nourishing yourself, doing something nice for yourself. I love this. I play gong. I've done a gong sound bath before, where you feel the vibrations from the gong through the floor while doing yoga. Amazing. Totally recommend it. Solo dates, breathing exercises. These are wonderful. I love the playlist idea. I'm thinking about doing that this semester too. Yeah, they're punk music. Oh, you got me, Sarah. Yeah, and you can mention these to your students, just another humanizing moment, where I'm a person, you're a person, and maybe we need to take a break, or maybe after this class, I recommend you do something nice for yourself. What's a nice thing you're going to do? Ask your students to share with each other the self-care that they do. My last note here is about the relationship between trauma-informed teaching and identity. So a lot of, unfortunately, education responds to expressions of trauma using punishment, and does not really take into account that students are going to bring their trauma with them, and we're going to bring our trauma with us. We can't leave it at the door. It's a pretty privileged stance to say, you can just leave it all behind, right? And that you don't deal with racism or sexism or classism or ableism or whatever you're dealing with when you go into class, because those things still exist. And punishment for expressing trauma is going to exacerbate non-belonging for minoritized students. So if we do want to intervene on that, actually Moya brought up some of these points already, but recognizing and validating what students are dealing with, intervening on harm. So later today, actually, the CTRL has a section about calling in. So calling in when you notice students using hurtful, problematic remarks and not allowing that to just stand in class, because that sends the message that you think it's okay. Question your own standards of scholarly or appropriate behavior. We're not training students to sit perfectly still and look at us and memorize things, right? We're training them to use different skills in the world. So we don't want to just reward them for, being stationary. Learn about different cultural and historical legacies that can impact your students when you have time, make some time for that and keep learning. And I'll pass it over to Kate to talk to us about compassion fatigue.
Thank you. That was all really helpful. We're going to spend, we've got about 15 minutes left, and we'll spend this time talking about compassion fatigue. Shed, I think you have to work these, right? Can you? There we go. Thank you. So just quickly, understand that a lot of faculty members, and I know employees on campuses as well, are doing a lot to support mental health of students. These statistics are from 2021, so it's a couple years old, but I'm betting it has not gone down in that time. I think it's probably still about the same. I would love for you to just take a look at those, and then I would love to hear your reactions in the chat. Like, do these numbers surprise you? Do they seem low? Do they seem high? What do you think about those? I keep going back to Sarah. Punk music. Yeah, I will tell you, mine is 90s hip hop. That's what I do. Yeah, 1 in 5 feels low. Yeah, it might be even higher than that. And 80% on target. I will tell you, it is not uniformly distributed across professors, as you can imagine. Women are having more of these conversations than men. People of color are having more. Transgender are having more, and also there seems to be more of the discussions happening among faculty who are sort of in their middle of their career. So very junior faculty and very senior ones are having fewer of the conversations. But yeah, I think it's important to recognize that it's both important that we are having these conversations with students, but also that it takes a toll on us. So next slide. Oh, and thank you I hope everybody's seeing Shed's comment in the chat. That's helpful. So just a quick definition about, yeah, exactly, Moya. Just a quick definition to understand what compassion fatigue is. We talked a little bit about vicarious trauma, which is I think of it as like the contagion effect of interacting with people experiencing trauma and distress. It kind of, we absorb it a little bit. Vicarious trauma is something that can happen in one conversation or one interaction. Compassion fatigue is a little different. It sneaks up on you slowly over time. And for that reason, it can be harder for us to catch. It's kind of like that expression, by the time you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. Compassion fatigue is a little bit like that. The way that it manifests is a diminished ability to empathize or feel compassion for others. So it's like you become almost numb. And so you could be reading about something horrible in the news or interacting with somebody who's experiencing something, and you think, why do I feel nothing at all right now? That can be compassion fatigue. So next slide. So what do we do? One of the things about compassion fatigue is because it is so, it builds up slowly over time. It is very, very difficult to catch it. Let me just give you a quick example of that. There was a guy that I worked with at the Justice Department for many years. He was a prosecutor of child exploitation cases. So really, really difficult cases. He was a great lawyer, great in the courtroom, also great with the kids and with their families. And he and I worked together on a project for a few years, and I just really liked him. He was just a really nice guy. He was easy to get along with, hardworking, polite, kind, just a great guy. And then the project ended and a few years passed, and I didn't see him very much in those intervening years. And then a second project brought us back together, and I thought, oh, this would be great. I'm glad to get to work with him again. But this time he was like a different person. He was so much more quick-tempered, angry, it seemed like just would be set off almost at a moment's notice over things like just the normal hiccups that you hit in any kind of project. He would just be so like, of course they're going to say that, and this is ridiculous. How do they expect us to? And I thought, what is going on with him? Finally, I realized that he was experiencing compassion fatigue, that all those years of working on those child exploitation cases had taken a toll on him. But the thing is, I don't think I would have seen it if I had been working with him every day. I think the only reason I recognized it is because we had that gap of a few years. And so the difference was pretty stark. But I think if you saw him every day, it would have been so gradual that you wouldn't have even noticed it happening until suddenly he was in this very different space and place. So because of that, what I recommend is with compassion fatigue, this is one of those areas where the best defense is a strong offense. Like you have to take affirmative steps to protect yourself from it, particularly if you are in a role or an environment where you are exposed a lot to trauma of others. It's going to be particularly important for you to take these affirmative steps. As somebody who has struggled with this over the years, I'm going to share with you my 3 best tips. These are hard-won tips and things that I still struggle to remember, but I keep returning to again and again. The first one is have self-care. I call it a daily reset. So something that you do for yourself every day. And we had some great examples in the chat already. And this is not something that you're that you feel like, oh, like it's not about losing 10 pounds. Let me just say that. So it could be that your self-care is exercise, but make sure that it's really something that is feeding your soul, that you're not just doing it because, you know, oh, I have to do X or Y or Z. It's supposed to be something that really makes you feel good. So think about whether you have something already that you do every day. I'd love to see in the chat. I mean, this is maybe in line with what you were just talking about in the chat, but are there things that you are making sure that you do every single day to take care of yourself? Like for me, I do a little bit of yoga and a little bit of meditation every day. Doesn't have to be a long thing. For me, sometimes it's 5 minutes combined. I mean, it's really short. I have a friend who every day at noon, her watch prompts her with a breathing technique for 1 minute. I remember speaking once to child forensic interviewers at FBI. So these are people who at a moment's notice can get a phone call and have to be on a plane within an hour because they have to go do this interview. They don't know if this kid can go home tonight until this interviewer talks to him or her. So for them, they're like, I have no control over my schedule. But one woman said, what I do is every morning, I don't know where I'll be, but wherever I am, I put my feet on the ground and I say, thank you. Thank you for this day. And for her, that's her daily reset. Maybe for you, it's art of some type. Shed says she's a doodler. I'm kind of a doodler myself. Music is a great one. So for me, with my 90s hip hop, I have a great playlist and I put it on while I'm making dinner and dance around the kitchen. My brother listens to opera in the car. So think about if there's something in the vein of art or exercise, meditation or prayer, maybe a gratitude practice can be a nice self-care routine, just something that you're doing every day just to really feed yourself. I'm just taking a quick look at the chat. Yeah, mindful meditation. Thank you, Janice. Yeah, and Shed, you've got your plants. That's a good one. That's kind of an art one as well. Moya, you take a photo of something every day. That's really beautiful. I love that. Yeah, 15 minutes of silence, walking and journaling, dance class. I love that. Oh, Thich Nhat Hanh's Happy Teachers. I haven't read that. I'm going to check that out. Thank you. Yeah, music and writing in your prayer journal. That's beautiful. Wonderful. So yeah, just think about, is there something that you can do every day? If you don't already have a practice, there are some great ideas there in the chat. So see if there's one that you could borrow to build into your own day. The next one is we have to get better about talking about the hard stuff. I think particularly people who are really good listeners sometimes forget that other people can listen to us too. So just right here, right now, I would love to see you try to think of 5 people that you could call on when you're having a hard day. And when you've got your 5, just write yes in the chat. So 5 people, it could be maybe, you know, friends, family members, colleagues, just somebody that you know that if you were having a hard day, you could reach out to. Okay, good. Excellent. If you're having trouble thinking of 5, journals can count. I love my journal. Don't underestimate the benefits of therapy. There are professionals out there who can help us work through issues a lot more quickly than we could on our own. And also work on developing those relationships. Ask a colleague to have lunch with you on Zoom or in person. If you see a neighbor who walks their dog at the same time you do, walk with them. Develop those relationships now, because those are the things that are really going to help you get through the hard times. And if you do have your 5 or your 4 or your 3, I would urge you, send them a quick text message right now and say, hey, just thinking of you, really glad that you're my friend, you're in my life. I hope you're having a great day. Just shore up those relationships, because those are pretty powerful. And then finally, recognize your warning signs. And by that, I mean those signs that you are beginning to experience compassion fatigue. We've talked about a few things like insomnia, sharper edge to your humor is a common one, maybe shorter temper, maybe you're getting sick a lot, reduced immune system. Just, if you're somebody who struggles with addiction, this might be when it comes and taps you on the shoulder. Just recognize your own warning signs. And when you see them, that's when you need to double down on 1 and 2. So recommit to your self-care and lean on others for support. All right, my friends, I was trying to finish up with a few minutes left. It looks like we've got just a couple. Are there more slides, Shed? I can't remember. Oh, good.
Perfect timing. I can go over these. I think that was our plan. I'm trying to remember. So this is a lot of resources, and we're going to share these slides with you after. So please don't feel like you have to, or maybe you want to screenshot them. But there's a lot of different options for reaching out to your students on campus. First, there's resources for you, but then there is also national resources, global resources. There's a lot of different ways that we can seek support. So these are some of the things that you might want to share with your students. Some of these options, like in your syllabus, or mention it to them. Trying to keep an eye on the that's a great question about trauma-informed language for class. And I would love to follow up on that after this. And I want to say thank you. Thank you so much.
Let me just say real quick on that,
yeah.
Shed. We can send out an email afterward, maybe to everybody, with some sample content warnings for the syllabus. I think it is helpful to have some options for that.
Totally. And thank you everyone for being present and engaged. Please do reach out to us. And Kate, what would you like to add here?
We forgot about Lucy's question about remote instructors. I'm so glad you came back. Thank you. So my advice on that, I think that in some ways there are both benefits and drawbacks to the remote classroom in terms of dealing with this type of issue. It is possible to just send a direct message to somebody when you're remotely, which can be a more subtle way of checking in on somebody instead of kind of collaring them at the end of class. So that can be really useful. You're going to want to do the same kinds of content warnings. It can be helpful to also let the students know that, for instance, it's okay to message you with, I might be a little bit challenged by this classroom, so they don't get called on. That kind of thing can be helpful. But I would make copious use of the direct messages for that. And then also, if possible, give them a subtle way of telling you that this is maybe a hard topic for me. I might not be as engaged because it's harder. Like in a classroom, you can see them, but when they're remote, you can't always see everybody at the same time, and so you don't necessarily know. I've heard people who they will tell people to like put something up in the Zoom picture, like I don't know, hold up a thing that would be an indication that this is a hard day for me. I'm struggling today. I need a little bit of space and grace today. So I hope that that's helpful. I know we did it quickly. We can share some more ideas by email.
I would also add, so I mentioned having small groups in your Zoom classroom for students to check in with each other just in a low stakes way, but also like we can take the opportunity of metacognition. So students reflecting on their own learning, you could maybe check in with them through the semester and ask them to maybe do a quick, it's like a participation grade, how are you doing? And Do you like, what's working for you in class? What are you struggling with? It could even be like 2 questions, right? But it could be a really good way for students to not just reflect on how they're doing this semester, but also maybe transmit to you if they feel confused or disengaged or something like that. And then always having those communication pathways open and reminding students of those communication pathways. You can get in touch with me about this, or my office hours are at this time. And if you need, if you feel like you need a little extra support or are confused or frustrated about something, I really encourage you to, send me an email, something like that. Maybe not with frustration, but with the person, but with the content.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Shed. I read about a professor who every day, the first thing in class is, I think, 2 questions where they're supposed to rate how they're feeling that day. And I think that's such a great way of making it okay to talk about how you're doing. So.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. And again, when you share a little, you don't have to share, like, you don't have to be like, well, I was born in Pennsylvania, but rather every now and then, like Kate said, saying, it like, yeah, I do feel exhausted by this, or, does anyone else feel like, after Thanksgiving, I always say to my students, does anyone else feel like, oh gosh, I can't do this, and they'll be like, yes. I'm like, I know, let's work together and get through this together,
Yeah,
So thank you all so much. We'll hang around a little bit more for other questions or thoughts or strategies that you would like to share, but we really appreciate you all being here today, and we will follow up.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck. Have a great semester.
A wonderful semester.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
What a wonderful crowd.
Yeah, it was great. I loved that.